Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. This is our second video on the motor or the descending spinal pathways. Now, if you have listened to my first video on the motor or the descending spinal pathways, then you might have become aware by now about the basic organization of the motor system. You might be aware of something which is known as the reflex arc, and you might be knowing by now that how do the motor neurons, the upper motor neurons, they influence the reflex arc directly or indirectly through the gamma motor neurons. Now, as part of this lecture today, we will talk in detail about the corticospinal tract pathway, and we'll talk about the various neuronal deficits which are produced by the lesions which could occur anywhere along the course of the corticospinal tract. Now, broadly speaking, the corticospinal tract pathway can be divided into two major types. We've got an anterior corticospinal tract, and then we've got a lateral corticospinal tract. The anterior corticospinal tract is much closer to the midline and is concerned more with controlling the axial musculature of our body, and hence is concerned with activities such as controlling the postural movements of our body and making postural adjustments accordingly, while the lateral corticospinal tract is more concerned with controlling the finer skilled movements of the periphery, such as the coordinated movements of the hands and the fingers. For instance, consider the example of this person in the image who is trying to screw a light bulb at the ceiling. Now, to achieve this, the motor information must travel through the lateral corticospinal tract, and it must travel to the limbs to coordinate the precise skilled movements of the hands and the fingers, whereas simultaneously the motor information should also travel through the anterior corticospinal tract to allow the muscles of the trunk to help stabilize the body. Thus, the anterior and the lateral corticospinal tract both work in a coordinated fashion in conjunction with each other to bring about this action, which is the screwing of the light bulb. Now, the lateral corticospinal tract is not the only sole pathway for serving the voluntary movement. Rather, they form the pathway which conferred speed and agility to the voluntary movement, and that is one aspect of the motor voluntary activities. Many of the simple basic voluntary movements are mediated by some other descending motor pathways as well, and we shall discuss them in detail sometime later in some subsequent videos. For now, let's talk about the corticospinal tract in detail. We'll talk about the entire pathway of the corticospinal tract, starting from the origin, from the cerebral cortex, and going all the way down to the spinal cord. And we'll briefly talk about the various sections of the brain as well, through which the corticospinal tract is going to pass through, starting from the cortex, going to the internal capsule, then the different parts of the brain stem, such as the midbrain, pons, medulla, and eventually, obviously, down into the spinal cord. Now, let's commence by talking about the origin of the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract originates from the cerebral cortex, and for that, in order to understand the origin of corticospinal tract, let's first have a look at this illustration and try to orientate this illustration and this image of the prosection of the cerebral cortex. So what you're looking over here is basically the left lateral view of the cerebral cortex. You can see the frontal end of the brain over here, that being the frontal lobe. This is the posterior or the occipital lobe. You can see the lateral sulcus over here, which is separating the frontal and the parietal lobes at the top from the temporal lobe down below. Now, what you can see over here are three parallel sulci, which are the central sulcus over here in the middle, and then right parallel to it, but in front of it, this is our precentral sulcus, and behind the central sulcus, we've got the postcentral sulcus. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe in the front from the parietal lobe at the back. The parietal lobe is primarily sensory in function, whereas the frontal lobe is primarily motor in function. Then the region over here between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus, this region is known as the precentral gyrus. That is the primary motor area, and it's part of the frontal lobe. Part of the corticospinal tract is going to be originating from here. Then the region here between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus. This is the post-central gyrus, which is the primary sensory area, and that is part of the parietal lobe. These areas are important to understand if you want to understand the origin of the corticospinal tract. We can see these regions very nicely in the prosection as well. You can see three relatively more longer, clearer, continuous sulci on the superolateral surface of the left cerebral hemisphere. These would be once again the central sulcus here. We can see the post-central sulcus right behind it, but parallel to the central sulcus. And then if this is central sulcus, then right in front of it, we've got the pre-central sulcus over here. Now, don't expect the sulcus to be one continuous entity all along its course. It could be interrupted at different points along its way. For example, you can see the pre-central sulcus kind of being interrupted over here, but still you can appreciate a more or less continuous entity. So this is a pre-central sulcus. Now, consequently, we can see the pre-central gyrus over here, right? And we can see the post-central gyrus over here, okay? Now, as far as the origin of the corticospinal tract is concerned, we can divide it into three different subparts. 1/3 of the corticospinal tract, they originate from the pre-central gyrus, which has been color-coded in purple over here. And remember, that was the area between the central sulcus at the back and the pre-central sulcus in the front. So this is part of the frontal lobe. This is also known as the Brodmann's area 4 as far as the histological classification is concerned. And we said that the precentral gyrus is the primary motor area. That can be seen very nicely over here as well. Once again, color-coded in purple between the central sulcus at the back and the precentral sulcus in the front. Then the remaining 1/3 fibers of the corticospinal tract, they originate from the premotor area. Now the premotor area has been color-coded in yellow or kind of orange over here, and you can see this is the Brodmann's area 6. Now the premotor area is a higher order motor association area, so it is more concerned with the motor planning. So once the motor activity has been planned over here, along with various other higher order association areas, that motor activity is then transmitted to the primary motor cortex, which then executes the motor activity through various motor tracts, including the corticospinal tract. The premotor area can be seen very nicely on the prosection over here as well. Once again, color-coded in yellow, and you can see the premotor area is still part of the frontal cortex, but in front of the primary motor area. Now, the last 1/3 fibers of the corticospinal tract, they originate from the post-central gyrus, which is this area over here between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus. This is the Brodmann's area 3, 1, and 2. You can see the post-central gyrus very nicely over here as well. Once again, color-coded in blue between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus. This post-central gyrus, which is the primary sensory area, it is part of the parietal lobe. Now that we know about the origin of the corticospinal tract from the cerebral cortex, how about if we talk about something which is known as the homunculus? So what is homunculus? Now, the motor control areas of the body are represented on the primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus in an orderly sequential fashion. This sequential representation of our body parts on the primary motor cortex is known as the motor homunculus. Now let's have a look at this illustration over here. So what you can see is basically the superior surface of the cerebral cortex. You can see the left cerebral hemisphere here and the right over here. You can probably appreciate the central sulcus over here on both the hemispheres. This region here is the precentral gyrus or the primary motor area, which has been color-coded in purple. This is the area which is sandwiched between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus. Now, if we take a coronal or a side-to-side section through the precentral gyrus, then you can see the coronal section over here. You can see the medial surface of the cerebral cortex shown over here. Well, this would be the superolateral surface, and you can see the lateral sulcus over here separating the parietal lobe at the top from the temporal lobe down below. Now what you can see over here is that our body is actually represented on the primary motor cortex in a sequential fashion, with the head and the neck region kind of represented over here just above the lateral sulcus, whereas the upper limbs and the trunk region represented still on the superolateral surface. And then the lower limbs, especially the knee and the leg region, is then represented on the medial surface of the cerebral cortex. Now, what does that mean? It actually means that this part of the superolateral surface of the primary motor cortex, this is controlling the muscles of the face and maybe the head and neck region. This part over here on the superolateral surface in the primary motor cortex, this part is concerned with controlling the muscles of the upper limbs. And the legs over here, the muscles in the legs are being innervated and consequently controlled by the region of the cerebral cortex which is on the medial side in the primary motor cortex. Similarly, a sequential representation of our body parts on the primary sensory cortex, which would be known as the sensory homunculus. Now, does knowing about the homunculus has got any clinical significance associated with it? Well, the answer is yes. It is clinically important to know the representation of our body parts on the primary and sensory motor cortex in the motor and sensory homunculus, specifically in context of the blood supply of the cerebral cortex. So let's just discuss that now. For instance, if you look over here, you can see that this region of the cerebral cortex, which is on the medial side, and plus this little 1 centimeter strip of the cerebral cortex on the superolateral surface, this is supplied by an artery which is known as the anterior cerebral artery, and this region has been color coded in red over here. And so if there's a stroke in the anterior cerebral artery, then the part of the cerebral cortex which is concerned with the movements of the legs and the lower limbs over here would actually potentially get infarcted. And so this patient who has a stroke in the anterior cerebral artery, let's say because of a clot over here leading to ischemia, or maybe there's a hemorrhagic stroke because of the rupture of the anterior cerebral artery, then this patient could potentially present with a paralysis or some weakness in the lower limbs, whereas the upper limbs would potentially get spared. And similarly, a sensory loss in the lower limbs could be actually elicited as well if the anterior cerebral artery involves the primary sensory cortex in the sensory homunculus region. On the contrary, if the region of the cerebral cortex on the superolateral surface over here, this is actually supplied by an artery which is known as the middle cerebral artery. This part over here has been color coded in gray, and so if there's a stroke in the middle cerebral artery, then the part of the cerebral cortex which could actually potentially get infarcted would be this region over here, and this is controlling the movements of the upper limbs and the head and neck region. And so a patient could potentially present with a weakness in the upper limbs, whereas the lower limbs would be spared. Similarly, a sensory loss in the upper limbs could actually be elicited as well if the sensory homunculus in the primary sensory cortex is also involved because of the stroke of the middle cerebral artery. But the lower limbs would be spared in this case. Now let's do a little exercise over here to clinically apply the basic science information which we have learned so far. So if you look at this example over here, we've got a patient, 65-year-old male, who presents with stroke. And because of the stroke, he's eliciting a weakness in his right arm or in the right upper limb. You have to choose from one of the options over here, which one is the best answer. Option 1, option 2, option 3, or option 4. Option 1 and 2 basically represent the superolateral surfaces of the left cerebral hemispheres. So you're looking at the left half of the brain over here, whereas option 3 and option 4 are the coronal slices which have been taken through the right cerebral hemisphere. So these are the right halves of the brain shown over here. Now what do you think, which option would be correct? Right, so you're right, option 2 is the correct answer. Why? Because see, this patient is presenting with weakness in the right arm, and we know from our knowledge of neuroanatomy that usually our left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa. And the reason for that is that most of the neuronal tracts, they are going to cross at certain point along the course inside the central nervous system, and this crossing is known as a decussation, and we'll talk about the decussation of corticospinal tract as well as we go down the line. So therefore the left side would be controlling the right side of our body, and therefore if the patient has weakness in the right arm, then this means that the left cerebral hemisphere is involved, which means that we can easily rule out option 3 and 4, which are the coronal slices taken through the right cerebral hemisphere. Now we have to choose between option 1 and option 2. Now we can see over here that this region here is the precentral gyrus between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus. So this is our primary motor area, and this region over here is the post-central gyrus, which is the primary sensory area between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus. Since the patient presents with weakness and the sensory information seems to be intact apparently, this means that the pre-motor gyrus would be, the pre-central gyrus would be impaired, and therefore option 2 is the correct answer. Now let's just change the scenario a little bit. So hypothetically, let's say we are presented with the same patient, 65-year-old who has a stroke, but this time this patient has a sensory loss in the right arm. Then once again, we know that since the right arm is involved, therefore we can easily rule out option 3 and option 4. We're left to choose between option 1 and 2. Now this time the weakness is not elicited, and only a sensory loss is being shown over here by the patient. So that means that the primary sensory area would be involved, and therefore option 1 would be the correct answer. The primary sensory area is involved, whereas the primary motor area or the precentral gyrus is apparently intact. Now let's say a 65-year-old male presents to us with stroke, but this time the patient presents with weakness in the left leg, right? So which option would be the correct option now? So we've got the option 1 and 2, which show the left cerebral hemisphere. Now the weakness is in the left leg, therefore the right cerebral hemisphere would be involved in this case, because we know that the right side of our brain controls the left side of the body, and left side controls the right side of the body, as we just already discussed. So we can easily rule out option 1 and option 2. Now we have to choose between the option 3 and 4, which are both coronal slices, side to side slices taken through the right cerebral hemisphere. Now, if you look over here, this gray region over here represents the area of distribution of the middle cerebral artery. This red region here represents the area of distribution of the anterior cerebral artery. We can see the sequential representation of the body parts on the cerebral cortex as well, which is known as the homunculus, a motor homunculus or a sensory homunculus. And since the weakness is involving the left leg, therefore, that means that this region over here is impaired because of an involvement, let's say, of the anterior cerebral artery, and hence the option 4 would be the correct answer in this case. Now, let's say there's a patient who presents with a stroke once again, but this time there's a sensory loss in the left arm, right? Since the left side is involved, once again, we can rule out the left cerebral hemispheres. So we have to choose between option 3 and 4, which are the coronal slices to the right cerebral hemisphere. Now, in this case, the sensory loss is in the left upper limb. Therefore, this region over here, which is the area of distribution of the middle cerebral artery, is involved, and so option 3 over here would be the correct answer. The lower limbs are spared in terms of their sensory distribution, which means that the anterior cerebral artery is intact, and so option 4 would not be the correct answer. The correct answer therefore would be option 3. Next, the corticospinal tract fibers, they radiate down from the cerebral cortex and they descend down to pass through the region between the basal nuclei and the thalamus. These radiating fibers are known as the corona radiata. So if you look over here, so you're looking basically at a coronal slice which has been taken through the right cerebral hemisphere, and you're looking at the lateral sulcus over here, which is separating the parietal lobe at the top from the temporal lobe down below. This is the superolateral surface of the brain, and this is the medial surface, which you can look over here. You can see the sequential representation of our body parts over here as well, which is the motor homunculus or the sensory homunculus in case of the primary sensory area. Now, what you can see over here is that the fibers are actually radiating down from the cerebral cortex. These fibers are known as the corona radiata. They're going to pass down over here in a region between the thalamus on the medial side and the basal nuclei on the lateral side. The corticospinal tract fibers are going to travel down through the corona radiata. Now, what you're looking over here is basically the left lateral view of the cerebral cortex. It's the prosection of the brain, and much of the cerebral cortex on the left side has been peeled off, so you can actually see the subcortical white matter very clearly, and you can see the white matter tract fibers kind of converging down over here. These fibers which pop out from the cerebral cortex and radiate down, these are known as the corona radiata, and they can be seen now converging down over here in a region between the basal nuclei and the thalamus. The thalamus is more medially placed, so we have to actually do a little bit more dissection over here and dig down inside to see the thalamus. We cannot really see that over here, but you can at least appreciate very nicely the fibers, the white matter tract fibers, which are coming down over here as the corona radiata and then converging over here. Next, the corticospinal tract fibers are then going to pass through a region which is known as the internal capsule. For that, let's have a look at this prosection over here. This is actually the left cerebral hemisphere, and we're looking at the medial side of the left cerebral hemisphere. We can see the occipital lobe at the back. This is the cerebellum, so that's the back end of the brain. This is the frontal lobe in the front. We can see the color-coded pathway of the corticospinal tract. You can see that it's coming down from the cerebral cortex, passing through a region which is known as the corona radiata, which we already talked about. And then these fibers of the corticospinal tract are going to actually pass over here in a region which is in between the basal nuclei and the thalamus. These fibers, actually, the corticospinal tract fibers, they really converge over here, and this convergence of the fibers is known as the internal capsule. What you can see over here is the thalamus, clearly visible. You can see this is an egg-shaped nucleus which is resting right on top of the brainstem. The thalamus is going to be the medial relation of the internal capsule. Now, if I take a horizontal slice at this level over here, at the level where the thalamus is present, then the horizontal slice is going to look somewhat like this. This is the horizontal section taken at the level of the thalamus. Now let's just orientate this slice, horizontal slice over here. You can see the thalamus is going to be on the medial side, and it's on the posterior side as well. So this is the posterior aspect of the horizontal slice. You can see the basal nuclei, the lentiform nuclei on the lateral side. So this is the lateral view over here, and this is the anterior side of the slice, right? So you can see the internal capsule is converged over. The internal capsule is this thick condensation of the white matter tract fibers which are passing between the thalamus and the basal nuclei. And if you look at the internal capsule, it has a V-shaped appearance to it. This is the posterior limb of internal capsule. This is the anterior limb of internal capsule. This angular part over here is known as the genu of the internal capsule. And you can probably appreciate that the corticospinal tract fibers, they're going to be passing through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. The genu, or the angle, is the part where the corticobulbar fibers, or the motor tract fibers coming from the head and neck region of the cerebral cortex, they are going to descend through. The corticospinal tract is going to be encompassing all those descending motor tract fibers which come from the part of the cerebral cortex which is controlling the neck and the upper and the lower limbs. Now, here you can actually see a horizontal slice taken at a prosection of the brain. So you can see the same structures over here, but this time you can see them on a prosection of the brain. You can see this region over here. These are the ventricular spaces inside the cerebral hemisphere. You can see the frontal lobes of the lateral ventricle over here. These are the posterior or the occipital lobes of the lateral ventricle. So that's the back side of our prosection, and you can see the internal capsule kind of represented over here. This is the V-shaped internal capsule. The posterior limb of the internal capsule is over here, which is sandwiched between the lentiform nucleus over here on the lateral side, and you can see the bumpy thalamus on the medial side. On the anterior side over here, this is the head of the caudate nucleus, and you can see the internal capsule is going to be medially related to the thalamus and to the caudate nucleus, whereas laterally it would be related to the lentiform nucleus. The corticospinal tract fibers would be passing, as we mentioned, they would pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This is once again a prosection of the brain taken at the same level, but you're looking at a Mulligan stain section. So anything which is gray matter, is going to be stained blue in color, whereas anything which is white matter is going to stay white. And you can see the blue colored thalamus over here on the medial side. You can see the head of the caudate nucleus, which is blue once again because this is all gray matter. And you can see the white matter tract fibers which belong to the internal capsule over here. The lentiform nucleus is once again the lateral relation of the internal capsule. This is the posterior limb, and the corticospinal tract fibers, after they pass through the corona radiata, they're going to descend down in between the thalamus and the basal nuclei through the posterior limb of the internal capsule before they enter into the brainstem. Next, the corticospinal tract fibers are then going to descend through a region which is known as the midbrain. So what is a midbrain? Well, midbrain is the first part of our brainstem. So if you look at this prosection over here, you can see that the brainstem has been shown over here. The brainstem has three different subparts to it: midbrain at the top, followed by this bumpy pons, and then the medulla oblongata down below, which is then going to continue down as the spinal cord. So the midbrain is the topmost part of our brainstem. We're looking at the left cerebral hemisphere over here. This would be the medial view of the cerebral hemisphere. We can see the back end, the occipital lobe over here, and the frontal lobe is going to be in the front. The blue color-coded dotted line over here represents the pathway which is going to be taken by the corticospinal tract. So what we can see over here, once that the corticospinal tract fibers, they pass down from the coronal radiator and they converge here in a region between the thalamus and basal nuclei in the posterior limb of internal capsule. From there onward, they are going to pass down over here in the anterior part of the brainstem, in the anterior part of the midbrain. This anterior region of the midbrain is known as the crus or the crura of the midbrain. You can appreciate now that the corticospinal tract has become a more or less anteriorly situated structure inside the brainstem. Now, if I take a horizontal slice at this level, at the level where the midbrain is present, then the horizontal slice taken through the midbrain appears somewhat like this. Now, this is a section taken through the midbrain, and you can see this is the posterior aspect of the midbrain. This is the back end of the brain. This is the ventral view, and you can see the crura of the midbrain over here. You can even appreciate the X-shaped orientation of the optic nerve with the optic tracts at the back, the optic chiasma, which is the crossing of the optic nerve fibers right in the middle over here, and then the optic nerves more anteriorly situated. Now, what you can see over here is a region which is known, this little hole over here is known as a cerebral aqueduct. It is actually part of the ventricular system of our brain. And then anteriorly over here, you can see this dark line over here, which represents the substantia nigra. This is dark because of the melanin deposition over here. The region of the midbrain between the cerebral aqueduct and the nigra is known as the tegmentum. The region behind the aqueduct over here is known as the tectum, and the region of the midbrain in front of the substantia nigra is the crus or the crura of the midbrain. This region here in between the two crura is known as the interpeduncular fossa. These are also known as the peduncles of the midbrain. Now, the corticospinal tract is going to be passing anteriorly in the midbrain. It's going to be descending in the midbrain in its anterior region, in a region which is known as the crus or the crura of the midbrain. Now, just to show you the structures a little bit more clearly, let's have a look at this illustration here. This is once again a horizontal slice which has been taken through the midbrain. You can see the posterior end of the midbrain over here. This region is known as the tectum. This is the part of the ventricular system which is known as the cerebral aqueduct. And once again, we can see substantia nigra over here. So you can see that the crura of the midbrain are right in front of the substantia nigra. These are, as we discussed before as well, also called as the peduncles of the midbrain. So this region would be the intrapeduncular fossa. The corticospinal tract fibers can be shown over here, can be seen over here highlighted in green, descending through the crura of the midbrain. This is a horizontal slice at the same level once again, but this is a mulligan stain section. So we can see once again the substantia nigra over here. We can see the cerebral aqueduct over here very nicely. This part over here in front of substantia nigra, these are the peduncles of the midbrain, and corticospinal tract can be seen descending down over here through the crura of the midbrain. Next, the corticospinal tract then descends down through the pons, which is the second part of the brain stem. So once again, you're looking at the medial view of the cerebral hemisphere. You can see the color-coded dotted tracing of the corticospinal tract. After passing through the crura of the midbrain, the corticospinal tract is going to be descending down over here through the ventral part of the pons. If I take a horizontal slice over here through the pons, then the horizontal slice of the pons looks somewhat like this. You can see this is the back end of the pons over here. Cerebral aqueduct, which was a narrow channel in the midbrain, has enlarged over here to form what is known as the fourth ventricle. The ventral part of the pons is characterized by these horizontally running fibers, which are known as the pontocerebellar fibers or the corticopontocerebellar fibers, and you can see the corticospinal tract descending down through these cortico-pontocerebellar fibers. In fact, when you look at a cross-section of the brain, these horizontally running fibers are the hallmark of the pons, and these are actually a nice identification feature with the help of which you can identify a cross-section, a slice of the pons. You can see these horizontal fibers here nicely, and you can see the corticospinal tract fibers descending down through the transversely running pontocerebellar fibers. Next, the corticospinal tract is then going to descend through the upper part of the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is the third or the last or the lowest most part of the brainstem. Now, once again over here, you're looking at the medial surface of the cerebral, of the left cerebral hemisphere, the back end of the brain being over here, the front end or the frontal lobe being over here. You can see the dotted line which marks the trajectory of the corticospinal tract, and you can see that the corticospinal tract passes through the diencephalon in between the thalamus on the medial side and the basal nuclei on the lateral side. It passes through the crura of the midbrain and then in the ventral part of the pons, where it is traversing through the transverse pontocerebellar fibers. From here onwards, the corticospinal tract, still anteriorly situated in the brainstem, it's going to enter into the upper medulla. Now, in the upper medulla, the bunching together of the corticospinal tract fibers basically produce a cylindrical elevation, which is known as the pyramid. So if you look at the brainstem from the front, we can see the brainstem from the front at the base of the brain over here. You can see the ventral part of the pons over here. This is the junction of the pons and the medulla. So this region over here is the medulla oblongata. And here you can see the cylindrical elevation, which is known as the pyramid. So this is because of the corticospinal tract fibers which are lying underneath this elevation, or in fact they are creating this elevation known as the pyramid, one on either side. We've got the pyramid here, we've got the pyramid here, and lateral to the pyramid we've got another elevation here. This is the olive, one on either side. The olive is because of another gray matter which is known as the inferior olivary nucleus, which is lying underneath over here and producing this elevation, and we're going to talk about that as part of the motor system sometime later in some other video. Now, if I take a horizontal slice through the upper medulla oblongata, then the horizontal slice is going to look somewhat like this. You can see the ventral aspect of the upper medulla over here. This is the posterior aspect. You can even see the fourth ventricle over here. So that should be the back end. Therefore, in the front, we can see two elevations over here, and one over here which is the pyramid, and another one lateral to it. This is the olive, and we just talked about that on the pro section as well. Now we're looking at a horizontal slice through those cylindrical elevations. So lateral to the midline, we've got this elevation called the pyramid. This is the place where the corticospinal tract fibers are bunched together and they are descending down in the ventral part of the medulla. And lateral to it, this is the olive, where the inferior olivary nucleus, this crumpled bag-like nucleus, is situated, and that is producing this elevation called the olive. If we look at the same structures in a pro-section, in a horizontal slice taken to through the pro-section of the upper medulla, we can once again see the pyramids constituting the corticospinal tract fibers lying underneath it, and lateral to it we can see this crumpled back-like nucleus, which is the inferior olivary nucleus. It's producing this elevation called the olive. This is a mulligan stain section of the pro-section of the upper medulla, and therefore anything which is gray matter is going to be appearing blue in color, and that is why the inferior olivary nucleus, which is basically a gray matter nucleus, that is giving a bluish appearance over here. At the back over here, this is the fourth ventricle, so this is the posterior aspect of this horizontal slice which we're looking at. Next, the corticospinal tract is then going to descend into the lower part of the medulla oblongata. This is the lowest part of the brainstem. From here onwards, the tract is going to enter into the spinal cord. So let's see what happens in the lower medulla now. Now let's have a section at the lower part of the medulla oblongata, and what you can see probably over here is that the corticospinal tract fibers are going to cross at this level. And remember, we said that all the spinal tracts, ascending as well as descending, they have to cross, more or less all of the tracts have to cross at some point. This crossing is called as decussation. So our descending corticospinal tract is going to cross in the lower medulla oblongata. So if we take a horizontal slice at the lower medulla level, then you can see it looks somewhat like this. You can see the elevation over here called the pyramid, one on either side of the midline. Now from here, the corticospinal tract fibers can be actually seen going posteriorly and laterally. And so from here onwards, you can see that 80% of the corticospinal tract fibers, they actually cross over. Now they're not anteriorly situated anymore, they're more laterally situated, forming what is known as the lateral corticospinal tract. From here, the corticospinal tract fibers, 80% of those fibers are going to descend as the lateral corticospinal tract in the lower medulla as well as in the spinal cord. However, remaining 20% of the fibers which do not cross at this level, they continue to descend down as the anterior corticospinal tract. Even those fibers later are going to cross at some point in the spinal cord, but at least they don't cross in the lower medulla. Now, from here onwards, the corticospinal tract fibers are then going to exit the brainstem and enter into the spinal cord. So if we take a horizontal slice through the spinal cord, we can see the butterfly-shaped gray matter in the center over here. The posterior sensory horns are at the back. The anterior motor horns are seen in the front. The white matter can be seen surrounding the gray matter over here. You can see that 80% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract which cross, forming the lateral corticospinal tract, then they can be seen actually descending down over here in the lateral white column of the spinal cord, in the lateral white matter of the spinal cord. 20% of the fibers which do not cross, they run ventrally. They are still ventrally situated. They run as the anterior corticospinal tract, very close to the midline over here. These fibers eventually decussate near the midline inside the spinal cord segment immediately before synapsing with the respective lower motor neuron in the anterior horns of the spinal cord. So eventually, both the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tract fibers, which are upper motor neuron pathways, they are going to cross at some level either in the lower medulla as the lateral corticospinal tract or at the respective spinal segment level as the anterior corticospinal tract. After crossing, after decussating, these upper motor neuron corticospinal tract fibers are then going to synapse with the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons inside the anterior horns of the spinal cord, and from there the lower motor neurons are then going to exit out through the anterior root of the spinal nerve and innervate the effector organs such as the muscles, for example. So let's just quickly summarize what we have learned about the corticospinal tract fibers so far. So the descending corticospinal tract fibers, which influence the voluntary skilled movements of the distal muscles of our body, especially the lateral corticospinal tract, and the anterior corticospinal tract, which adjusts the posture of the voluntary movement. These upper motor neurons, they are going to start from the cerebral cortex. They originate from over there, and then they project down through the coronal radiator and then through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. From there, they pass through the crus of the midbrain and the ventral pontocerebellar fibers in the pons, and then running down into the pyramids of the medulla. So in the brainstem, in the midbrain, pons, and medulla, the corticospinal fibers are going to be more anteriorly situated. Now here onwards, in the lower part of the medulla, most of the fibers are going to cross, and then these fibers which cross over, they've constitute what is known as the lateral corticospinal tract, which then descends down in the lateral part of the lower medulla and the spinal cord as the lateral corticospinal tract. Remaining fibers which do not cross, they run ventrally in the lower medulla and in the spinal cord, forming the anterior corticospinal tract, which eventually cross over as well at the respective spinal cord segment level before the synapse with the lower motor neuron cell body inside the anterior horns of the spinal cord. Right, so in this lecture, we discussed the corticospinal tract in detail, and we talked about the lesions of the corticospinal tract at different points and discussed what kind of a clinical deficit could result by lesions in the corticospinal tract at those levels. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you benefited from this video. If yes, then please do like the video and don't forget to subscribe the channel. Bye for now.